Welcome back to Navigating the Noise with your hosts Gemini and Will. So, have you ever wondered about the rules for a soldier or for a ship way out at sea? What about for an army right here at home? Well, today we're exploring exactly that. All those invisible lines and rules that govern power on land and sea. From the code a single soldier has to live by, all the way to the laws that apply in the middle of the vast open ocean. These are the rules that really shape how countries and people act in some of the most complicated situations on Earth. So, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start small with the individual soldier. Then we'll zoom out to see how things work within our own borders. From there, we'll head out to the high seas. After that, we get into a really tricky question. What's the difference between a crime and an act of war? And to wrap it all up, we'll look at how the military defines its own force through its internal policies. All right, let's get into it. First up, this soldier's code. So what exactly does it mean to be a service member? Well, a huge part of it is that you're playing by a totally different rulebook than a civilian. And this system, it's the absolute foundation of military discipline. And that special rulebook is called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ for short. The best way to think about it is like this. It's a set of rules that applies to military members 24/7. And I mean 24/7. It doesn't matter if they're on or off duty. If they break a rule under the UCMJ, they can face military discipline. And that's often on top of any trouble they might get into with civilian law. And you might be surprised by just how many people this code applies to. It's not just for active duty folks. We're talking activated reservists, guard members, cadets, and midshipmen who are still in training. And yeah, in some situations, even retired members. The whole point is to have one consistent standard of conduct, no matter what branch you're in. Okay, so we've covered the individual. Now let's zoom out a bit and talk about the line at home. There's a really, really important legal line that keeps military and police work separate here in the U.S. And that line is drawn by something called the Posse Comitatus Act. It's an old law from way back in 1878, but it's a huge deal. What it basically says is that you can't use the Army or the Air Force to enforce laws here at home. You can't use them like a national police force. And that separation of military power from civilian authority, that's a cornerstone of how the U.S. government is supposed to work. Now, technically, the original law only mentioned the Army, but the spirit of the law has been applied to the Navy and the Marine Corps through other policies. Now, that doesn't mean the military can never get involved on U.S. soil. There are some really important exceptions. For example, they can give indirect support, like lending equipment or providing training to police. And they're absolutely essential during big disasters, like a hurricane, where they help with logistics and medical aid. But here's the key thing. They can't be the ones making arrests or searching a citizen's home. That's a job for law enforcement. Okay, so we've got rules for soldiers and rules for the military at home. But what happens when you're out where there are no borders at all, like on the high seas? Well, as you can imagine, that brings a whole different and way bigger set of rules into play. We're talking about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short. People call it the Constitution for the Sea, and honestly, that's a pretty good description. It is a massive, massive agreement that nearly every country in the world has signed. It's the rulebook that covers everything from who gets the fish and oil under the sea to what a ship is supposed to do if there's a rescue. So UNCLOS basically divides the ocean up into zones, kind of like rings spreading out from a country's coastline. That first ring, closest to shore, is the territorial sea. It goes out 12 nautical miles, and inside that zone, a country's laws are in full effect. The next ring out is the exclusive economic zone, which goes all the way out to 200 nautical miles. In that area, the country gets special rights to all the natural resources, like fish and oil. And then anything beyond that, that's the high seas. It's open to everyone. So the further you get from shore, the less control a country has.
So that raises a good question, right? If a ship is way out on the high seas, whose laws does it have to follow? Well, that's where something called flag state jurisdiction comes in. It's pretty simple, actually. A ship's flag is basically its passport. It tells everybody which country's rules that ship has to follow, no matter where it is in the entire world.
Okay, now we're going to get into something that is really, really complex. When a fight breaks out, which rulebook do you use? Is it just a crime, something for the police to handle using human rights law? Or has it crossed the line into being a full-blown armed conflict, governed by the laws of war? Making that call is one of the toughest and most critical distinctions there is. And this really shows you the night and day difference between those two sets of rules. In an armed conflict, the rules are the law of armed conflict. The goal is to win, and targeting enemy fighters is allowed. But in a criminal situation, you're using human rights law. The goal isn't to win, it's to make an arrest. And using deadly force is the absolute last resort, something you can only do if there's an immediate threat to someone's life. So, what does it take for violence to officially become an armed conflict? Well, legally speaking, it comes down to two main things: intensity and organization. First, the fighting has to be pretty intense, and it has to go on for a while. We're not talking about a one-off riot. And second, the groups involved have to be organized like a military. They need to have a command structure. They need to be able to plan operations, maybe even control territory. And that's a big reason why, for example, a lot of very violent groups, like drug cartels, usually don't legally count as an enemy in an armed conflict. All right, for our last section, let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about the big external laws that govern conflict. Now let's look inward, at the internal rules the military makes for itself, the policies that leadership puts in place to keep the force ready and effective. How the military defines its own force and what makes it ready is a topic that's always changing, and let's be honest, often debated. For instance, you can see very different approaches depending on who's in the White House, especially when it comes to personnel policies around things like gender identity. This quote here shows one viewpoint laid out in a proposed executive order, which argues that some ideas about identity don't line up with the selflessness required for military service. And when that viewpoint drives policy, it leads to very specific actions for the Department of Defense to take. Things like updating medical standards for who can serve, rolling back previous policies on gender identity, and putting new rules in place for things like pronouns or the use of barracks and bathrooms. The stated reason for these kinds of changes is always about prioritizing military readiness and making sure units can work together seamlessly. It's a really clear example of how these internal rules directly shape what the military looks like and the standards it holds. So, when you pull it all together, what have we seen? From the UCMJ for one soldier, to the Posse Comitatus Act keeping things separate at home, all the way out to UN CLOS governing the entire ocean. All of these diverse and kind of invisible rules are really about one thing: managing power. They're all trying to create order and predictability in some really complex situations. They're the lines that tell us who can do what, where they can do it, and when. But of course, those lines are always being blurred by new challenges, right? Things like drones, cyber attacks, and even private companies are changing the game. And that leaves us with a really big question for the future. As these old lines get fuzzier, what new rules are we going to need? Thank you for being here, and as always, we love hearing your thoughts. So leave them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep navigating the noise.